Welcome, everyone. I'd like to thank you to our Beechwood Board of Education meeting for October 14th. Lori, would you like to do a roll call?
Mrs. Berger.
Here.
Mr. Hood.
Here.
Mrs. Slate.
Here.
Mrs. Stricker.
Here.
Mrs. Sullivan.
Here.
Thank you. Staff members present, anybody on the...
No sign-ups to speak?
Okay, on to the best part, recognition of guests. Dr. Stacy will...
All right, we have one student recognition tonight, and we're absolutely always, this is our best part of the meeting for sure, but we have the opportunity to congratulate Miss Sylvia Wessel on her Governor's School for Entrepreneurship. So if you'll come up, Miss Wessel, we'll like to take a picture with you, and I do have questions, so don't be running off. Don't be running off afterwards. Here you go, right here. Yep. All right. Good job. So, I always enjoy the Governor Scholar stuff, right? I mean, it's a very unique and interesting opportunity. Now, where were you at?
I was at Gatton College of Business at UK.
All right, Gatineau College of Business. All right, so tell me, did you do an individual business plan?
Yeah, so we worked with teams to create like a business pitch, and then we pitched all of them on our demo plan at the end.
Right, so what was your team's pitch?
It was a volunteer app where it connects like volunteer organizations with volunteers based on their interests.
All right, so anybody could log on to your app, say they were interested in volunteering in a general area, and it would work to connect them with their interest.
Yes. Exactly.
Awesome,
Yeah.
awesome.
Personality tests and everything.
that's
Good
nice.
thing I didn't take that. There's no
Personality test.
That may have been a little dangerous. All right, so tell me, what was the two biggest takeaways that you won't forget?
Two biggest takeaways are definitely I realized I'm very passionate about entrepreneurship and I want to start my own business one day. And I also just made a lot of relationships. There was a lot of networking and I learned a lot from the
Always.
guest entrepreneurships that came to. There were a lot of guest entrepreneurs that spoke to us.
Okay,
That's awesome.
now tell me, what did we do best to prepare you for Governor's School for Entrepreneurship?
You provided a lot of business classes, especially dual credit through Ms. Stamper and the Edge Miners to help me prepare for all the little terms and everything at GSE.
That's awesome.
All right, one thing that I've noticed, like, you guys are definitely getting better about getting up in front of a group, speaking, and not even missing a beat. All right, so congratulations, well done, and we appreciate you coming tonight and give us a chance to recognize you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm also going to piggyback on that, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Right, so that's absolutely one of the reasons why we have an entrepreneurship lab going in your new building. Right, the amount of kids that will be asked to come through and start businesses or have entrepreneurial mindsets over the next couple of decades cannot be underestimated. Also, when you're doing that, right, for any of you that are self-employed or doing something from a business standpoint of your own, you have to have a better understanding of how to invest your money, set aside your money, and financially plan. And that is also included in that curriculum. So that's why I also thank you for giving me an opportunity to get a plug in for our lab. So much appreciated.
How long, is that just the second year or? That they've
The
been
Governor's School
doing
for
that?
Entrepreneurship has been around for some time. It was not as old as GSP or GSA.
Third or
but-
fourth year, isn't it?
Oh, is it
Was-
that many
Third or
years?
fourth year, maybe?
Yeah, no, it was actually at Georgetown College,
Oh.
since some of us know that. It was at Georgetown College for probably about a decade before it moved to Northern Kentucky. And then now it's kind of bounced back a couple of different places. So it's been around for a while. It's just not as nearly as long as the other two.
I didn't know that.
But still can't be underestimated, the skill development that they get in that aspect. And Sylvia's also right. The number of entrepreneurs they bring in to tell how they did stuff and how they got started is equally important. So, any other questions or comments?
No.
All right,
Great
thanks
job.
again, appreciate it.
Okay, on to public comment. Do we have anybody signed up? to speak?
Nobody signed up?
Okay, on to our discussion and action agenda. Our first item is a motion to approve the CATS offer of assistance for $16,844. Take a motion.
I'll move to approve the CATS offer of assistance at $16,844.
I'll second, if you can hear me.
All right.
Sorry.
Okay, so this is not uncommon, happens 3 times a year. This is smaller amounts of money that come through to Tim's budget for technology throughout the building. We're actually using some of the old CATS offers to do the informatics lab. This is $16,000 and some odd dollars. We'll keep it into a balance. We're not necessarily using it today, but we're waiting to see what areas we might need support as we move into the new space.
Okay.
I'll
Any
make a
questions?
motion
All right.
to approve it.
Any questions?
We've already
Any
done that.
questions?
Huh?
We've already done that.
We've already
made the
done that.
motion?
Melanie and the.
You just can't hear me.
I
No,
gotta
it's
move
not
over
your
that
Yeah,
fault.
corner
it's,
over there.
it's
It's
not
not
your
your fault.
fault.
You
We
can't
need to
hear me
speak up a little
tonight,
more for you.
Amy's voice is going, so you might
Can't
not have
talk.
heard that. But,
Amy
okay.
doesn't have
Any
much.
other
I'm just
questions?
gonna raise my hand.
Any other questions?
Is that what he thinks?
Okay, ready to vote? All right, let's vote.
Mrs. Berger?
Yes.
Mr. Hood?
Yes.
Mrs. Slate?
Yes.
Mrs. Stricker?
Yes.
Mrs. Sullivan?
Yes. Okay. Okay, on to our next item, a petition for a waiver of the classroom. We'll take a motion to approve the petition or waiver. Yeah.
I'll make the motion.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Got you. We have a second?
Second.
Okay.
Okay, this is one of the things that I thought Joe did, Joe thought I did, but actually it has to be the Board of Education, and this is just the legal language. We have never had a full stove in our MSD FMD classroom because we have a culinary lab, right? So as part of being an inclusive mindset at school, we definitely want our students being out about as much as possible. So while we want to have a kitchenette, and we have a kitchenette in the new room, we did not plan for a stove or a sink, an exterior, a kitchen sink. We have a sink in the restroom, but we just had a refrigerator and a microwave to practice on some of the things for the the students while they were in the room. But as part of, like I said, an inclusive mindset, not every place has a culinary lab that we can use during the planning period. So therefore, you as a board have to make a motion to petition the Commissioner of Education to waive that piece of equipment. So that's what we're officially asking you to do.
So basically, it's not going into that new classroom, but they're still going to be able to use this like they've done already in the past.
Yeah, so they still have a kitchenette.
Right.
It just doesn't have a stove. And we just haven't had an exterior sink because we've had, we have a sink inside. So those two pieces, I mean, if we follow the thing, would be a part of that design. But for space and for, just to be honest, some other safety, I didn't really want a full operating stove in our MSD lab when we're a small school and we have access to a full culinary lab. So that was the reason. I just thought that they had applied for the waiver because typically waivers go through the Department of Education on the planning and implementation of the plans phase. But since it's a waiver of the MSD, you have to do it as a board. So that is the piece.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions?
Seems like an
Okay.
awful lot of not for nothing.
Mrs. Berger?
Yes.
Mr. Hood?
Yes.
Mrs. Slate?
Yes.
Mrs. Stricker?
Yes.
Mrs. Sullivan?
Yes. Okay, motion carries on to our consent agenda. Take a motion to approve the consent agenda.
I'll make the motion to approve the consent agenda.
Okay,
I'll
Amy?
second.
Okay.
Okay, there are a couple of things I'd like to point out. Number one, Just our state reporting, our technology activity report, we submitted. The one that is different is a trip over 100 miles. The girls softball has petitioned the board to go to Florida during spring break to play in a tournament. That'll be funded by the fundraising for their agency. And then the two that are very normal are the band KMEA state championships in Louisville and the band regional trip to Estill County. Those are the same. And then obviously the next phase of pay applications for the construction. Any questions?
Girls softball is going to Florida? That's exciting. Is that what the cookie fundraiser is for?
That is what the cookie dough fundraiser is for. That and T-shirts are the two that they have going right now. Sounds like they got a decent deal, and the girls are excited about it. And I know they are trying to build roster, increase their roster. So they're hoping that will help support that
Right.
outcome.
Good. Okay, any other questions? Nope.
Mrs. Berger?
Yes.
Mr. Hood?
Yes.
Mrs. Slate?
Yes.
Mrs. Stricker?
Yes.
Mrs. Sullivan?
Yes.
Okay, motion carries on to the information portion of our meeting, superintendent's report.
All right, Chris, do you have anything you want to update on the financial?
No, because it's still really new. It's going through everything.
I don't think there's anything, I agree, I don't think there's anything after the initial working budget that we need to put out. We are on track as far as we're a little behind on the construction project, but we are on budget, so that's a good thing. SBDM minutes you have included, and now we have Josh Schulte here from KSBA. He is going to come up and do a short presentation on Senate Bill 2.
Welcome, Josh. Thank you for coming out tonight. We appreciate it.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I appreciate you all allowing me to say a little bit about a very important, pressing issue that communities across the state are considering with Constitutional Amendment 2. And I'd like to say that many school boards across the state, I would say at least half, and that's probably an underestimate, at some point since the summer have put discussion of Amendment 2 or brought the issue up in some capacity as an agenda item, simply because it is such an important thing that has potential impact on all public schools. And the Kentucky School Boards Association, what we've spent probably the lion's share of our time doing in recent months is to help districts understand, particularly school boards, how they can talk about the issue, because it is such a broad-reaching thing. There's been some confusion out there to the point where at times the Office of the Attorney General has had to weigh in. There's been a lot of opinions on social media in terms of what can and can't be done in public school settings. Fortunately, I think most districts have come to understand what their role is in having these conversations. And so again, I appreciate you all doing this and going about it the right way. We've been putting out a lot of resources to school board members, so I know you've received a lot from us already. This was a discussion topic at our regional meeting. We put it in our publications, in our e-blast updates, and provided you with lots of resources. But I did want to hit a couple things because we are just a few weeks out from the election, and provide some context as to what Kentucky voters are going to be essentially deciding whether or not to amend our Constitution. So what we're seeing today is really the culmination of about 7 years, I would say, where this discussion about whether public funds and their potential use for private schools or non-public schools has kind of been evolving. So if you go back to 2017, that's when we first had charter school language put on the books, where Kentucky at that point was legally allowed to establish charter schools. What we didn't have at that time was a public funding mechanism. So there was no legislation in place that really established a taxpayer funding mechanism for charter schools. While we've not lost the ability since 2017 to have charter schools. It's that public funding mechanism that's really been in place. So for the first 5 years after that legislation passed, which was House Bill 520 in 2017, the legislative supermajority could not come to an agreement on what, if any, public funding mechanism would look like. So for the first 5 years, it was fairly dormant. Although as school board members, you remember charter schools very vividly, because every year since 2017, for a number of years, you were required to get a lot of charter school
12
authorizers.
hours to be
12
exact.
hours, very, yes.
Yes.
Each and every year, school board members were required to complete 12 hours of charter authorizer training, because you, with a very few exceptions, our school boards across the state are the sole authorizers of charter schools. So when an application comes through, you ultimately are going to be the first stop of that application. Thankfully, a couple years later, because there were so few applications for charter schools coming through, the legislature did us a solid and alleviated some of that training burden, considering how few applications come through. Only 2 or 3 since 2017 have come through statewide. Where now that training you're required to get only really kicks in if you receive an application, then there's kind of an active training component to help guide you through that process of reviewing an application for a charter. But in that also that same 7-year period, we've also seen a couple bills introduced and then subsequently struck down in the courts because the bills were deemed unconstitutional because they were essentially allocating public funds for private schools, which as the courts have decided, including the Kentucky Supreme Court, how we define common schools, how we even define charter schools and all these things, prevent us and strictly prohibit public funds from being used for private schools. And that's essentially what's gotten us to this point. The legislature, because of the problems with finding a public funding mechanism, because of some legal defeats in striking down efforts to allocate public funds to private schools, they took the step to pass House Bill 2 this past legislative session, which put this question to voters for a constitutional amendment. That was passed this past spring. A lot of times you'll hear it referred to as different things: Constitutional Amendment 2, Amendment 2, the Voucher Amendment, the School Choice Amendment. There's a lot of different terms for it. And what essentially it's prompting voters to decide is whether or not the Constitution should be changed in a way that would give our legislature new authority, so authority they currently do not have, to direct public funds or tax dollars to non-public schools. And whether you want to define that as charter schools, parochial schools, private schools, home schools, organizations that might set up shop and provide non-public education services, this would be permitted for the legislature to direct those, to consider legislation to direct to those things. There's no enabling legislation attached to this constitutional amendment, which makes it fairly unique. Typically, with an amendment like this, you would have a bill attached to it. So if the amendment were to pass, you'd kind of have some sense of, okay, well, now this bill's in effect. We know what to expect from it. One of the concerns that I think those who oppose the amendment have is the kind of the vague, open-ended nature of the amendment, and the fact that we don't really necessarily have a clear indication as to, if it were to pass, what kind of legislation could we expect? How far would we expect public funds to be allocated, redirected, and how would that potentially impact or disrupt the funding of public schools? So that's one of the questions I think is being kind of hotly discussed, hotly debated publicly right now. It's this amendment that's separated from previous amendments we've had, in that, again, there's not really real clarity as to what we can expect from it. I'll use the Constitutional Amendment 1 that's on the ballot this year. We're talking about Constitutional Amendment 2, but there is an Amendment 1, which essentially is asking voters to decide whether or not non-citizens, whether or not we and I'll to quote, to prohibit persons who are not citizens from being allowed to vote. That's a very simple amendment to understand, what's being asked of voters. What's being asked in Amendment 2 is a little bit more open-ended, gray, murky, in part because it's just new territory for us, but also the wording doesn't necessarily lend itself to that clarity. To that end, let me just read to you what the constitutional amendment language says. This is what's going to appear on the ballot. You all have seen it, but just for the sake of discussion. To give parents choices and educational opportunities for their children, are you in favor of enabling the General Assembly to provide financial support for the education costs of students in kindergarten through 12th grade who are outside the system of common public schools by amending the Constitution of Kentucky as stated below? And here's the proposed amendment. The General Assembly may provide financial support for the education of students outside the system of common schools. The General Assembly may exercise this authority by law. Sections 59, 60, 171, 183, 184, 186, and 189 of this Constitution notwithstanding. The amendment, there's a lot of language in there, terminology in there that might not necessarily be crystal clear. When we talk about to give parents choices and educational opportunities, we're essentially saying to allocate public resources for organizations or for students to potentially attend private or non-public school. When we talk about enabling the General Assembly, we're talking about giving them new kind of broad authority to pass legislation that would allocate funding for non-public schools. Financial support in the amendment language, we're talking about tax dollars, public tax dollars. So it references education costs in the amendment. So financial support for the education costs of students. Generally, when we think of non-public schools, we think in terms of tuition dollars. But as board members, you know that in terms of what it costs to educate a student, there are so many more costs beyond that for public schools. When you think of special education programs, accommodations that are made available to students, transportation, food service, things like that, even extracurriculars. Those are not necessarily things that non-public schools are required to provide to students. So even that language in terms of education cost represents kind of just some vagueness, some grayness that we're not necessarily quite sure will come out the other end if this amendment passes. The other thing I want to point out, and I think this is an important part because it gets buried in the details, but that where it says the General Assembly may exercise this authority by law, sections 59, 60, 171, 183, 184, 186, and 189 of this Constitution notwithstanding. I never thought I would care so much about the word notwithstanding. It's a word I don't know if I'd ever used prior to the passage of House Bill 2. But in legal terms, generally speaking, when you hear the word notwithstanding, you're thinking regardless, in spite of, in exception to, or ignoring. So it essentially, when you read all those 7 sections, we're essentially, if we were to pass this, be giving the legislature authority to ignore those 7 sections of our existing Constitution. We create legal exceptions in doing that. And I think it's important that folks understand those 7 sections. They're not just random numbers. They're very important parts of our Constitution, and that's why it's so important we have open dialogue and open discussion, and we have an informed electorate when they go in to decide how they feel on this amendment. So those sections we're talking about. So again, we would be creating legal exceptions to these 7 sections that would allow the legislature to ignore them when considering funding or considering legislation about education funding. Sections 59 and 60 essentially prohibit the legislature from passing special legislation or targeted legislation that might impact, say, one school or one district or one county. We have that in place, so traditionally we've had that in place to prevent kind of unfair, inequitable legislation. And it's ultimately one of the things that's prevented some of our recent school choice legislation to be struck down in court because it violated that section of the Constitution. Section 171 requires that taxes can only be collected for public purposes. So we would be allowing the legislature to ignore that part when it comes to education funding. 183, the legislature would be able to ignore the provision that says it is responsible for establishing an efficient system of public schools. It would be able to ignore 184, which prohibits taxation for funding of non-public schools. They would be able to ignore 186, which says education funding exclusively to be used to maintain the state's public schools. And then they'd be able to ignore 189, which currently prohibits public education funds from being used for religious schools. So again, not just a random assortment of numbers. These are real sections with a lot of precedent and a lot of impact should the legislature have new authority to essentially kind of circumvent those sections for education funding purposes. We've heard a lot of terminology thrown out, and I think one term that I want to give kind of better definition to is the word voucher. Again, this is often referred to as either the voucher amendment or the school choice amendment, depending on what side of the argument you're on. Voucher kind of has a technical definition as well as a general definition. Vouchers are essentially publicly funded certificates that allows some students and their families to redeem essentially the tuition fees, et cetera, at non-public schools. Generally speaking, though, when people talk about vouchers, it's kind of taken on a more general term. You know, like sometimes instead of saying, I need a tissue, you say, I need a Kleenex. Same approach here. When people say vouchers, they're talking about really any mechanism that takes public tax dollars and directs it to non-public schools, or it gives it use for non-public schools. Whether it's an education opportunity account, scholarship tax credit, education savings account, all those things generally are kind of all loosely considered voucher
But
programs.
when you refer to vouchers, that's not going to be something that would pay a full tuition. That's just like going to be just a certain amount? Is that what they're proposing? or-
It can depend on the program.
they haven't
Generally
even said
speaking, if you think in voucher, if you think as a voucher, oftentimes it's equated to what, say, per pupil funding might be, or some percentage of that. It doesn't have to be, but that's oftentimes how it's discussed. If that's the case, we know that there are a whole lot of private schools, and I think Northern Kentucky is a prime example where you have a probably higher density of those private schools. The kind of the seek base, the per pupil seek base, would not cover the full tuition at a private school. Not to mention all the other kind of extemporaneous costs as it relates to transportation and special accommodations and things like that. So I will say, oftentimes I've heard, you hear a lot of facts and you hear a lot of half-truths, and then sometimes you hear just blatant misunderstandings of different elements of this issue. And one thing that I hear a lot is, well, Kentucky's kind of an outlier. We are on an island all by ourselves. We're the only state that doesn't allow for this type of thing. It might be true that Kentucky is one of, if not the only state currently that has a constitution that is as rock solid as it is in terms of not allowing public tax dollars to be allocated for private schools, but we are certainly not by ourselves in terms of other states that have chosen not to go down this road. Even without a constitution that prevents them from doing so, scholarship tax credits are only available in 20 states. Education savings accounts are only available in 18 states. Vouchers are only available in 14 states. This idea of open enrollment, which makes Kentucky very unique, and I think this deserves some credit. A few years back, you might remember House Bill 563. It was rather controversial because it essentially took away some local autonomy of school districts to locally negotiate their non-resident enrollment agreements. In doing so, it moved Kentucky towards more of an open enrollment model, where essentially students can enroll in other public school districts even if they don't reside in that district. That type of programming is only available in 3 states, and we are one of them. So when you say Kentucky doesn't have school choice, in some ways we are well ahead of the curve. We are one of only 3 states that, for instance, in an area like Northern Kentucky where you have so many great districts, you also have the ability, or students have the ability to attend more than one, which is rare across the United States. I will say the Kentucky School Boards Association, a lot of times we can't take positions on issues, in part because we represent 857 locally elected school board members in 171 unique districts. So for us to be lockstep in agreement on anything is tough. It doesn't happen a lot. And we don't simply go by simple majorities. Like, 51% of our members feel this way, we're going to support it. Nope, it has to be a lot more overwhelming than that. But when we take a position on a bill, it has to be in line with what our board of directors, made up of all locally elected school board members, approves. It has to be in line with our guiding principles, again, approved by our board of directors. And it has to reflect, when we do legislative surveys every couple of years, what we feel our membership at large really feels strongly about. And with that in mind, one of our guiding principles that we've had for years and years and years and years, even decades, for some at KSBA who've been there a long time, is opposition to redirecting public funds to K through 12 schools outside the common school system. So KSBA as an organization has long held, based on member feedback, that we do not support redirecting public funds to non-public schools. We felt that way long before it was cool in a constitution, proposed in a constitutional amendment. So with that, we believe that kind of some of the more common arguments that we've heard among our members, and again, when I say overwhelming consensus of our members, our most recent survey that sampled, we gave it out to all of our members, and it represents a fifth of our membership. So 20% of school board members filled this out. Geographically, they're all over the state. Makeup of districts, they're all over the map. So we do believe it is an accurate reflection of what our membership feels. More than 95%, 96% oppose this amendment. So we believe we are reflecting what the average school board member feels about this amendment. We think private schools aren't held to the same oversight, rules, transparency, accountability, and governance structure as public schools. And as I heard someone recently so beautifully put it, allocating public funds to non-public schools creates greater distance between taxpayers and the decisions about those tax dollars. And that's a concern for a lot of people. Private schools are not bound by law to serve all students like public schools are. They have the luxury of picking and choosing, in part maybe because they can't accommodate those students, which is understandable, but they can decide through their own admissions policies who they admit. Public schools don't realize significant savings when students leave their district and take advantage of one of these school choice programs and use those tax dollars for a private school. And that's a big misconception. Well, the students gone, so are the costs. If you have a dozen students who leave this school, you think that's going to lower the number of employees you have to have, or the fixed cost of running this facility, or do you think it's going to eliminate bus routes? You're still going to have a lot of those same fixed costs, even if you're losing those students to choice programs and their per pupil funding is going with them. Lastly, not all communities have the same choices. I think Northern Kentucky, you all are very blessed to have so many great public and private school options for education up here. But there are districts across this state where not only are their public schools the only school system that they have at their disposal, it is the lifeblood of the community, the largest employer, and there are I think there's 70 districts or so that don't have any private schools in their geographic area. So I will say that nationwide, when you look at other states that have these types of programs, the majority of the students currently who are taking advantage of voucher-style programs were previously already enrolled in private school. So, and there's an argument being made, and I think it's being made genuinely, that this is to help the students who really need another option, who maybe they feel like their local school isn't satisfying their needs or getting them what they need. The fact is that more than half, 60, 70, even more in certain states, % of students who are taking advantage of these programs are already in private school. And then if you look at objective analysis of these programs in other states compared to the performance of students in public schools, and which is sometimes hard to do because of the lack of accountability and transparency in those private schools, you can't always compare apples to apples. So it's very tough to do. But when you have that objective analysis, you're not seeing spikes in performance. In many cases, you're seeing mixed bag or even lower performance. You have greater rates of transience. You have some students who are simply locked out of these options because the schools will not accept them. So again, I want to make that clear that our public schools are definitely keeping up with, and in many cases, exceeding what these alternative options being proposed are doing. So with that, I think I've already probably taken too much time, but I appreciate it. As you can tell, I've been talking a lot about this stuff.
And passionate about it, I can tell, so thank you so much.
That's a good
Do you have any?
presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So do you mind if I ask a couple questions? Because unlike the board members, I'm not an elected official, right? So I can't take a public stance.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's anything wrong with me asking questions.
No.
Right, so question one, is it normal for an amendment to be on the election cycle that asks for 7 sections of the Constitution to be diverted?
In terms of the number of sections, I don't know that off the top of my head. What I will say, I'm not aware of any recent amendments that I think so fundamentally change major provisions of the, and I certainly don't know of one that's had such, that would present such a fundamental groundbreaking change in the education space. I will say that.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Question 2, is it true that not only is money going out to, allegedly money going out, because we don't really know how it's defined, but it also takes away the requirement in the Constitution, Section 183, that requires them to fund common schools?
I think because of the vague wording of the amendment, that's up for debate. I think I've heard folks in support of the amendment say that this does not eliminate the legislature's requirement to fund public schools. But what I will say is, in part because so many of the students in other states who take advantage of these programs are already enrolled in private schools, that's a new cost. So I think one of a couple things can happen. You've got all these new costs. So either they're going to raise the education budget, which we know they're not necessarily beating down the doors to do. You all can potentially raise your taxes locally.
Mm-hmm.
Or there's going to be a net loss for public school funding.
But is that section included in the 7?
Yes, they are creating a legal exception for the section of the Constitution that requires the legislature to adequately and effectively fund public schools. To what degree that requirement remains with that legal exception is unclear at best, I will say.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, one more. And you dipped on that there wasn't any state requirements or state reporting or open records laws for private schools, but is there any curriculum expectations that are bound by the state for public or, private or homeschool?
Their homeschool, I would say, no. I will say for private schools, with standards in terms of core safety and core, there are some core things that all students, all schools, public and private, to be a certified private school, you have to meet certain minimum
Right,
requirements.
if you do the accreditation.
Yes.
Right, if you're
But that
accredited.
leaves so much other stuff in terms of your requirements to be open and transparent with Open Meetings Act, Open Records Act. They're not governed by public elected boards. Curriculum and curriculum, they really have Wild West freedom to do what they want.
So why crazy? Because there are a lot of good ones. So I don't want to
Sure.
take away.
Sure.
There are some amazing homeschools that I appreciate the opportunity to have it. But is it true that somebody, whenever they tell us what curriculum they're going to use for homeschool, it could be Nickelodeon?
That I don't know. I'm probably not the
And
best
season
to ask on
1,
that.
could season 1 be first grade and season 2 be second grade?
Well, yeah, and yeah, I guess in theory it could be SpongeBob SquarePants, but I am not a curricular specialist, so I won't.
No,
speak to that.
I'm just asking questions. And finally, my last question. I've heard that we're an oddball because there's 13 states that, haven't done some of these things. But, do all states have the same constitution, or are some of them more rock solid and more deep in their requirements of school funding?
It's a scale. I would point you to South Carolina as a state I'd use as a kind of a recent example where their state Supreme Court recently made a decision that essentially struck down certain programs that they were trying to initiate that would direct public funds to private schools. Now, I don't think.
Is that possible in Kentucky that could happen?
I'm sorry.
Is that possible in Kentucky that could happen?
It has happened. Two bills, one that essentially established a mechanism for charter schools a couple years back. After 5 years of not being able to come to an agreement on that mechanism, they essentially said, well, charter schools can essentially follow the SEEK formula and some other stuff. Courts, how our Constitution defines common schools, they found that charter school did not mix with that. While I think people make the argument that charter schools are privately run public schools, our Constitution had a lot more teeth in terms of how it defines non-public schools. So in that way, it was struck down. Another thing we had essentially scholarship tax credits from a couple years ago that were passed. And it was struck down because these were dollar-for-dollar tax credits that folks would get if they donated to these third-party organizations that would then dish out this money for some families to attend private school. Some would be religiously affiliated with, you know, private schools and things like that. Why it was struck down was it had a provision in the bill that only families who lived in counties of 90,000 people or more could use it for tuition. So basically, 8 counties could use it for how it was intended. The rest were out in the cold. And they found that to be unconstitutional because it violated the special legislation 59 and 60, which this amendment creates exceptions for.
Yes. All right, thank you very much. School funding in Kentucky is a very complex thing for us.
Yeah.
So the only thing I would say is I'll have to study it quite a bit because it's not easily understood. You have any comments or questions or statements?
Go ahead.
And I know you don't know, we don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
But let's just say, we live in Fort Mitchell. I don't know how many kids attend Catholic school here. I would say 20% maybe. I have no idea. But we have some great Catholic schools around here. Okay. I have the feeling that the state legislature is not going to give us extra money for education. I mean, they haven't in the past. So does that come out of our funding for, because they live in our district? Does their money come out of our budget?
I mean, in theory, if we adopt programs that allow per pupil funding in some way or another to follow a student wherever they go, that's when the student chooses to enroll elsewhere and take that money with them, that's less dollars the public schools have. And again, because per pupil funding unintentionally creates this notion in people's heads that to educate Bobby, it costs $5,000. But there are so many fixed costs, so many district-wide costs that are still there after Bobby might choose to go elsewhere. We're talking about a funding formula, not an allocation formula. They don't need, in the budget that they have every 2 years, they can raise they can raise per pupil funding, they can decrease per pupil funding without touching the formula. The formula is just how we compute it. So based on what's happening in other states, which is really one of the few things we have to go on, because we haven't been given any clear indication of what kind of legislation would come from this, which I think, in theory, if you're going to change 7 sections of the Constitution, you should be able to say, this is generally our game plan, and we haven't received that.
I was going to say, that's part of the problem, is there's nothing, they're not proposing anything, they just want to take those parts of the amendment. Or
Constitution was
the
1891, right? I think the current.
Yes, 1890, 1891.
Yeah, 1890, and then passed and put into place in 91. Has there ever been a time where an amendment's been put on the ballot that hadn't been tied to specific legislation, so we knew what we were voting on?
I will say with amendments that tend to be very black and white, and I'll use 2 examples. The governor can run for consecutive terms. That was a constitutional amendment. The legislature can meet annually as opposed to biennially, every 2 years. That was a constitutional amendment. Now, I don't know for certain if there was eventually enabling legislation attached to those, but again, it was crystal clear what people were voting on. And in some cases, amendments are boring. They're just changing some rules to.
I think there's been 41.
Yeah. So, but the ones that are more complicated and complex tend to have enabling legislation attached to them. And those kind of serve as a North Star for what voters can expect to happen if the amendment passes. We have legislators who say this really just opens the discussion. This gives us more tools in our toolbox. We don't know what those tools are and how powerful those tools can be. So.
Anything else?
Well, I don't know if we're allowed to say this, but I'm voting no on it.
You're an elected official. You can say a whole lot of things.
Yeah. I'm not voting for it. You know, I don't see how it can't, I mean, first of all,
It can only hurt.
It can only hurt. There's no
correct.
upside other then, you know, people who already attend private schools can get some money, but that's only gonna hurt the public school.
Agree.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
intend to vote no for all the
Right.
reasons you brought up. I think it would be a bad decision to take money away from public schools and give them to non-public schools that don't have to educate every student. I mean, that's one of the biggest reasons I'm against it. I'm a little concerned that they've done a good job marketing it to be confusing and labeling it as choice for students when it's really not a choice for all students. And I don't see a lot of, I mean, I would love to have a no sign for my yard, but I don't know how to get one. But I don't see a lot of marketing and educating. I'm concerned that the voters may not know what they're voting for.
And I would say that there are probably a lot of Kentuckians that don't know. You know, we've heard from people who are very big supporters of their public schools, who thought that voting yes was how they were going to protect them. You know, we've heard of that there being mailers, and remember, the amendment simply gives the legislature authority to implement voucher-style programs or direct public funds to these private entities. Really, at that point, it's up to the legislature. We've heard of promotions and mailers and things that folks are getting, and that's saying that
Right.
if Amendment 2 passes, it will raise teacher pay, and it will protect public school funding. Whether they genuinely believe that that's going to happen downstream or not, that's not what this amendment does. It essentially adds to the systems that the state can fund. And right now, there's only one system that the state is required to fund, and that is the public school system.
I'm not sure you can hear me, but on the ballot, you listed the specific numbers of the constituents that they're wanting to change. Will the numbers just be there, or will they actually list what those amendments, what those changes they're making, so the person that comes in to vote, if they're not informed before they walk in, to them, they're just numbers. They don't really know what they're voting for or
What I
against.
read earlier was just like, here's the prompt, here's the question. That is what they will see.
So they're not going to.
They will not receive any context
making it
as
very
to,
confusing.
as to what choices mean, as to what funding means, and those sections will just be listed as
The section.
59, 60, 171, 183, and the rest. So we live in this stuff, and it's complex to us. To the average Kentuckian, I would say it's far more complicated, and there's going to be many folks that, if it weren't for conversations like this in the public setting, if it wasn't for groups that are trying to at least raise the level of dialogue. For instance, I know at the Kenton County Public Library tonight, there's a forum discussion taking place, and I applaud organizations that are trying to put those things on to help inform the electorate. And that's a challenge with any election. I think this one hits closer to home because it has potentially such a huge impact on education. Yeah.
Just so much misinformation that's out there right now, and especially in our area, I think we're being more, flooded more with that information. So, and Melanie, you're right, it's hard to get signs.
I know.
So we're working to get signs here, so. If you know anybody in Northern Kentucky that can get us signs.
Just trying to wrap my head around why our election.
I'm about ready to make my own sign.
I don't,
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense.
Right.
No. But they've been working towards it for several years with the bills that they've been passing, so.
Right.
And one thing KSBA created, and again, with the intention of informing our members, but informing the public and allowing you to inform your members. I've left these at a few school board meetings I've attended, but this is an information sheet on Amendment 2. It does not tell people how to vote. It does not say this is good, this is bad. It gives a history of recent legislation, terms and definitions, and talks about those sections of the Constitution that we're creating exceptions for. I'll leave them here. Again, as we've been making our rounds, we've just made these available to whoever wants them. So they're welcome to have them. Anyone's welcome to have them. One less thing I have to carry home. So.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Just thank you, and I will absolutely end by saying we are blessed in this region. Our private schools are amazing. They make us better. We have a lot of amazing homeschools. So we are extremely blessed to have a lot of choice, and we appreciate that, that competition. Thank you for coming and sharing your knowledge on this topic. It is a very important topic that has a huge implication down the road. So thank you for your time and your energy.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Strobel's going to come up. We're just going to do a short overview of our assessment scores. We have a lot to celebrate on top of some other things. So she's going to just go over kind of the highs and the lows. So Dr. Strobel, go right ahead.
Yes, good evening. I'll try to keep this brief. Board members, you have the detailed data, spreadsheets, slides. Happy to discuss more anytime. And also want to mention, I'm going to keep this brief because our wonderful admin teams are also later in the year going to give an update on August joint session. We talked about goals for the year, work of the year. They're going to give an update on the work towards those goals, which of course includes KSA as well as AP, ACT, and other assessments that we take. So we'll start, and I know you can see on the big screen, we'll be sure to link this on the agenda as well. Beechwood Elementary at the top there, I won't read to you, but you can see rankings and such. Overall state color system, this is accountability. Several years ago they moved to the color system, with blue being the highest, red being the lowest. But really for tonight's purposes, as Dr. Stacy said, I'm going to focus on strengths, growth areas, and then what we're going to do about it, the most important part. I can't say enough about the admin team out here and how they really, every time we get data, our admin team, our teachers, our staff dive into, okay, what do we notice? Yes, we want to celebrate together, but also what can we do about it? Everyone really looks at it from their role, and what from my role can I do to improve? Strengths to celebrate at the elementary level, fourth grade reading and math was a huge increase. That same group of students from third grade to fourth grade made quite a jump. Just one example, in reading, 48% proficient and distinguished to 74% proficient and distinguished from third grade to fourth grade, so that's huge growth. I should have, to back up, sorry, publicly, each student, when they take a test, their score is either novice, apprentice, proficient, or distinguished, with novice being the lowest, distinguished being the highest. So typically, in looking at state data, what we really look at is percent proficient and distinguished for quick overview points, because that's the goal, is for students in Kentucky to be at least proficient. So that's a great celebration. Also, pretty much on every assessment at the elementary level, we are 20+ percentage points above the state average, so we are very proud of that. However, we still have a little bit of work to do. Growth areas, third grade reading and math, when looking at the percentage of proficient and distinguished, it's not as high as we would like it to be. In analyzing data, we can see that we are not quite, when we say in most categories we're 20+ percentage points above the state average, that's not the case for third grade. So that's an area of growth for us. Science, fourth grade, if you look at the state comparisons I sent you, science in general is lower on a state average, but we want to continue to work on that for our fourth grade science test. And then writing across grade levels. They do take at the elementary level the on-demand writing test in fifth grade, but of course that affects everything, because on each of the assessments they do have some writing. So even when they're taking a reading test, a math test, a social studies test, they do still have to do some writing. Okay, what we're going to do about it at the elementary level. They've done a nice job of planning out last week at team meetings on October 10th. They kind of set the groundwork of going over the data in more detail than I'm doing with you this evening. And then each grade level, so even down kindergarten, first, second, third, all the way up, they are looking at the data and saying, okay, what could I do for my role to help? So even if I'm primary, what am I doing to prepare them for leading up to the third grade test? Each grade level is going to share out some of their takeaways, what they notice in the data, what they could suggest for improvement. So they're getting feedback from each grade level team this week at team meetings. And I really love how it's a school-wide effort where we celebrate together and we also work on improvement together. We do have, as we talked, I believe at joint session about, we have a new reading program this year, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, as you can see on there. And Envision was new last year, so of course, as you know, with implementation and change, there is some time for that to take effect and make an impact. And so both of those are fairly new for us, program adoptions, but we're very excited about that vertical articulation, meaning from kindergarten all the way up, that we are aligned in what we are teaching, how we are teaching it, but we need to continue to work on that and how we are supporting our teachers with that, how we are implementing professional learning as well. At the elementary, we do common assessments in all grade levels. Now, those are not KSA predictors. However, they are a great way for teachers to be using assessment data to help them improve instruction. And we look at those as grade level teams. We analyze those as grade level teams. So we kind of revamped those last year and anticipate we can use those even better this year to help students get experiences. Third grade, first time they take the state test. I shouldn't talk with my hands when there's a mic in front of me. But third grade, it's the first time they take the state test. How are we using common assessments to make sure that students are getting practice that looks like KSA well before the state test arrives in May? And then foundational literacy programs, so that's looking at phonics, phonemic awareness, those foundational skills for our young ones in the primary grades at K1-2. K1-2 is not tested at the state level. However, that's super important to build that foundation early on leading up to third grade. We have aligned that curriculum much better now, I think, and revamped that. And so we anticipate that we can continue to grow with that support. You want to say anything about elementary or keep going?
Go ahead.
Okay. I will say that just to clarify for our unique situation here at Beechwood, even though our elementary is preschool through 6th grade and high school is 7th through 12th, when the state looks at our test scores, Beechwood Elementary only goes up through 5th, and then we have a middle grades reporting factor, which takes into 6th grade from our elementary, and then 7th and 8th from our high school. So we do still get a middle grade.
State sees us as 3 schools instead of 2 on accountability.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. And so sometimes you might see it publicly listed as Beechwood High School, but it does include 6th grade as well as 7th and 8th when you look at the middle grades. Again, rankings there, blue, highest level. Strengths, 6th grade reading and math, very, very high percentage of proficient and distinguished. Average in each category in the middle grades, 6th, 7th, and 8th, 25% proficient and distinguished over the state average. Growth areas, 7th grade science, again, we bring up that's something that is certainly not just Beechwood, but across the state, looking at how we can continue to grow in that area. 8th grade reading and writing, I'll say again, there was a little dip last year on that, but I think those are skills that aren't just in 8th grade and English class, that's more across content areas. So plans for growth, again, they talked about using the HMH new reading curriculum. It's reading and writing to fill in gaps both in the standard classroom, but also what they call Reading Lab, which is our intervention classes for those who might need a little more support. Middle grades work sessions, I love this. We implemented this, I don't know, at this point a handful of years ago, but to get our 5th grade through 8th grade together. So we are bridging that gap, even though we are 2 schools here, making sure we get those middle grades together. This year, the admin team specifically decided that we will be getting in November the science teachers and the English teachers together. Science because continued area of growth, and we have some new teachers in that area, and then English because of the new curriculum, and make sure that we're getting them together to align from the vertical standpoint and share instructional practices as well. Data to differentiate for individuals. Ms. Bromley brought up this point, and I think it's a really good one. We typically at Beechwood have a low percentage of novice, that lower level. We typically have a pretty high percentage of proficient and distinguished. But how do we make sure we hit that group that's scoring apprentice to get them to proficient? We have a lot of supports for those who are performing very low at the novice level. Again, our students are thriving on the higher end. How do we be sure we're leaving no one behind and getting those students who are scoring apprentice and moving them to proficient? And a lot of that is an individual basis and looking at the students' data across years. Finally, professional learning tied to KSA and assessment analysis. So just like we talked about the elementary team meetings, PLCs at the high school. Departments will continue to dive into this assessment analysis and already have started. And we also have some professional learning opportunities that our teachers are taking advantage of, such as there's a science one totally focused around this assessment that we will be sending some teachers to. Finally, the high school. Again, rankings at the top, blue, highest, very proud of that. They have a few more indicators that go into their accountability score. And so on this slide, when we're talking Beechwood High School, that is just 9 through 12, but they test at 10th and 11th grade. Graduation rate, you can see there, 100% for the 5-year cohort, 93.5 for the 4-year cohort. That is due to our Senate Bill 128 kids. Who back, if you remember, after COVID, there was the opportunity for them to repeat a grade level, which means that does still count in not graduating in 4 years. So that will soon be past us. I believe this year is the last year that has some Senate Bill 128 kiddos. So just to explain that. Post-secondary readiness, really proud of the team with this one. They try to get every kiddo to post-secondary readiness. That could be through meeting benchmark on ACT, industry certifications, coyote testing. So there's several ways they can meet to show they are ready for life after high school. Most of our students get it through the ACT, but really the team has just done a phenomenal job of working on what each student needs and can do to be post-secondary ready. And so 99% last year were post-secondary ready, which is very high. 10th grade reading and math improved and were great when you look at percentage proficient and distinguished. And again, as you've seen on the other slides, we're typically about 20 percentage points above the state average. Growth areas, 11th grade science is a major one for us. However, it's called suppressed data, which means pretty much across the state, almost the entire state. If you have less than 3 students scoring in one of those categories, novice, apprentice, proficient, and distinguished, your data is suppressed, which means it can't be public. So staff can see, but it can't be public. That is for almost everyone in the state because the distinguished is so low, meaning less than 3 students across the state. That's true for most districts. But that is a growth area for us for sure, and something that we'll talk about working on in a moment. And then 11th grade writing and editing mechanics. So again, you'll see 10th grade reading and math was a strength. They only test at sophomore and junior level at the high school. And then juniors, on-demand writing, editing mechanics, still were strong, but we took a little dip last year. So really, the high school's working on implementation into daily practice. That's something not just for KSA, but ACT, AP, how are we using assessment tools in the classroom daily, giving them that practice daily. A lot of times they learn the content, but maybe the way it looks is different, so making sure they're getting that practice. They've already started diving into some other districts who have great scores in certain areas, specific areas, and saying, what do you do? Can we collaborate with you? Are there instructional practices, things that are working for you that we could learn from? KSA Science, as we've said, that's an issue across the state, but for us, again, we have the professional learning that will happen in January, February related to the science assessment. They have some ideas for doing kind of a challenge practice around the 11th grade science assessment. And helping the students not only understand the phenomena-based type of assessment, it's a little bit different type of assessment, but also kind of some buy-in into why this is important and we're all in this together type of thing. And then science and English vertical curriculum alignment, we talked about the middle grades. At the high school, it's departments and making sure that even when new teachers come in and things like that, we have end of course expectations and they ensure that nothing's getting missed from year to year. Science, another component, is it's not where 10th grade English, everybody has the same class, same teacher. Our juniors are in all different types of science classes. How do we ensure that everyone's on the same page with the standards and the KSA practice, whether they're in AP Bio, Chem, Physics, no matter what class they're in, they're getting those experiences and that content that they need. That's the super fast version. We could talk about this a long time.
That's a lot of information.
Yes,
and a
I
lot-
know.
Yeah, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Breaking
So
down.
I'll just add, we have a lot of great staff, and we have a lot of great students, and typically we always get to celebrate test scores. There are a couple areas that we want to address, science being one of them. But at the same time, when the Gatton Academy and Craft Academy have less than 1% of their students in their science areas scoring distinguished on science, there is a statistic, and we're not even allowed to share the data. We know there is a statistical issue there that is being addressed, and because of that, it's hard to know exactly. The only reason I say science is because it pops up in multiple different areas, and because of that, I think that has to be an area of concern. And we've also talked since COVID too, making sure our primary rigor in primary is where it needs to be. It's definitely not bad, but it is the end of primary, being third grade, the first time it's assessed, is the one that's most out of line in the percentage over state norms. So that is our other area of concern. Outside of that, there's way more things to celebrate, but those are definitely the two areas that we've had probably the most discussion around. Any other questions? Okay, I know it's been a longer meeting, but I do want to just go over a couple of things. As far as construction, and I'll work from outside in. Stadium entrance, the sign package is in. They're waiting for install on that when they do the sign package on the rest of the building. Drywall in the locker rooms is almost complete. We did and we will start getting some complaints. We pulled all of our electricians over to the main building to maintain our timeline there. But we have, and it's HVAC instead of HVAC over here. We do need to get the heat on over here now. So we had some complaints earlier about the air conditioning. I know we'll have some complaints this week about the heat. So that should be a pretty quick fix. But it got a lot colder, a lot faster than we were expecting a couple weeks ago. I mean, now. So they're working on that on Friday and today. Hopefully that'll be on this week. Locker rooms are a little bit, that'll be touch and go. Hope by the time we come back in January, but we have made that a second priority. As far as the main building, they have two more specialty ceilings to put in. The media design and the biomed, they're finishing up the idea lab up top, and then they'll start moving towards and flooring. Atlas has 3 crews here finishing the wood in the auditorium. I think as far as the start of school in January, the only thing that I'm concerned about is the stage and the basement. Those 2 areas. That if there's anything, I think that'll be the 2 areas, but that shouldn't hold us up on occupancy because they can access it from the back door, and that area can be locked off from the main building. So I mean, unless there's a curveball, which there always can be, but not expecting anything to upset the timeline with the amount of workers that we have on site. The flooring guys will be the last. They're supposed to start tile in the atrium on November the 4th. They are sending 2 crews to double up and work 2 shifts. I think that's probably a 2 to 3 week. Furniture is slated, the first round furniture is slated for the first floor on November the 11th. Fast signs and all the detailing is the 18th. I believe, right before Thanksgiving, and we've told them that has to be definitely completed by the first week of December. Auditorium seats right after Thanksgiving, going in, and the only reason the delay on that, because Atlas says they'll be out by November the 4th, is they have to get lifts in on the concrete floor to put up the clouds. That has been we had trouble getting the clouds, the sound clouds, in. So outside of that, I mean, I do expect students to be roaming halls in January. Now, punch lists, I think punch lists will go on, for a little bit of time. But like I said, unless something else happens that is unforeseen, we're in pretty good shape for January. If we do ribbon cutting in the last week of December,
what I was just
or
gonna
in the
ask.
December, I
Are
would
we
just
still
say that
shooting
there'll
for-
be a couple areas that, we I might wanna have to work around.
Are you still working towards
Specifically the
12?
auditorium. Yeah, we're holding, I'm just gonna ask you all to hold back, after the meeting, just to have a discussion on the start, no business, but just to have a start of discussion on the,
Dates.
committee, for the for the ribbon cutting. If you have any specific questions, I invite you to stop by anytime, look through. We're not planning any more public tours. It's just too active. We're averaging around 70 guys on site every day, and it's just too active of a work site with too many moving parts with the flooring to have people in there. Any questions?
Not a one.
All right, that's all I've got. Other than, I would also like to say, it's rare to be in the district ever, to get any kind of #1 ranking in any area. To do it multiple years in a row with Niche is definitely something to highlight. Again, students and staff and their accomplishments. That's pretty rare. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Okay. Our next item is a motion to go into closed session.
So moved.
I'll second.
Okay.
Soccer's in the region. What night? Tomorrow
Tuesday
night.
night. It's Tuesday.
And where is that at? NKU. Tomorrow night, NKU against the Dirty Birds.